Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
It's award season at Below the Line, and this is the third of 12 planned episodes, where panels of film industry professionals discuss the nominees in their category of expertise. Today, we're talking about visual effects, and I've got two returning guests. Kent Secchi, your visual effects credits include The Matrix Revolution, Superman Returns, and Iron Man. Nice to have you back.
It's great to be back, Skid.
Also returning to the show is Chris Batty. Chris, your credits include A Wrinkle in Time, Creed 2, and Aquaman. And you're a member of the Visual Effects Society, abbreviated as VES, which is the visual effects equivalent of SAG or the DGA. Nice to see you again.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Glad to have you both here. Listeners, before we get started, you can learn more about these guys by going to imdb.com and searching for Below the Line. Every episode of the podcast is listed there with my guests, and a click on their names will take you straight to their credits. Okay, the 5 2023 films nominated for visual effects are The Creator, Godzilla -1, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and Napoleon. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this a warning. Also, as a reminder, we like to recognize our below-the-line compatriots by name, even if it means I'm occasionally mispronouncing some of them. Of course, my guests should know their names themselves, than being in the community, and if they don't correct me, then the blame is shared. Either way, apologies in advance, and let's dive right in. First up, The Creator. The nominated team is Jay Cooper, Ian Comley, Andrew Roberts, and Neil Corbould.
I think it's Corbould.
Corbould. Thanks,
Yeah.
Chris, for getting right on that. Appreciate that right out the gate. All right.
That's the only one I got.
Well, and as we'll see, that one's coming up again. We'll see if I get it right next time.
Yeah,
But, let's dive right in. What do you guys think about the visual effects on The Creator?
So The Creator is a really interesting case. It's sort of more of a scrappy down and dirty. I know it's, I think it was about a $80 million movie, definitely under $100 million movie. And so the process was a little different. The director's Gareth Edwards. You know him from like Rogue One, and he'd done some other independent stuff. So what they ended up doing is they kind of flipped the paradigm of visual effects. Usually, you shoot and you plan things out and you have a lot of blue screens, and usually the last few weeks is kind of demarcated as the kind of visual effects weeks in the shoot schedule. But this one, he just sweet talked the studio, got a very small crew together, almost like he was shooting a nature documentary, and they went all around Southeast Asia, kind of primarily in Thailand, and shot the whole movie. Just with actors on normal locations. And then afterwards, they took all that footage back and brought it to ILM. And then those geniuses just started painting within the plates that he shot. And so it's kind of very interesting in that way, where they're sort of painting on top, instead of fully modeling out an entire environment and city and just hoping that they, just sort of planning out those shots. What they did is they shot first and then inserted the CG elements. And so it's really an interesting movie, and it's a good story too. And so I was pretty excited to see that, and also we should mention that the primary challenge of the visual effects in The Creator, they had to kind of come up with these designs and implement them in a way that doesn't take away from the actors' performances. So, The Creator is all about, these AI robots. And so he would hire just normal actors, and then they would post-treat it afterwards to give them more of a machine-like, at varying degrees, machine-like physicality. So that way he could kind of keep all their performances, and then just insert those into the plates. That way the audience can maintain that sort of emotional connection to each character. And it was quite interesting.
So I think the creator is a great example of like sort of modern VFX work and it playing a role, but in helping support the story. It's almost like you took all of Gareth Edwards' experiences of making monsters as an independent feature and what he did in Godzilla and Rogue One, and it combined it all in this run and gun style photography. They even famously shot with a prosumer grade $4,000 mirrorless camera, the Sony FX3, and they used that so that he could actually shoot a lot of the photography himself, along with the DP Oren Sofer. And they had a very extensive and very crucial time with Greg Fraser before they actually shot the movie, where he was acting as the DP. There was a scheduling conflict. He couldn't follow through and finish the film or actually go on the photography shoot. But I think all of that sort of took on a life of its own. And it's almost like the movie is Rogue One meets Ex Machina in terms of like how the VFX that were being used. Like in Ex Machina, even though that had nothing to do with Gareth Edwards, it was all about the performance of Alicia Vikander, and the VFX supported that performance. And in the same way that Chris had mentioned, the designs of the robots of this half human, half robot all sort of met. They felt very human, minus the back of their skull and sort of little nuances that caused them to be, oh yeah, they're robots. Like you can see through their head with this giant hole in the back, that sort of gave you the machinery of who they were. And so that was a case of where they used that style of shooting, that run and gun, long takes, and sort of fit in. And they're thematically this year with a lot of the VFX nominees, it's a different year. Sometimes you find themes in the year, and this year's theme was let the filmmakers do what they want. And in past years, the VFX will put restrictions on how they would shoot in order to achieve the effect. And I think if you look at this film, Napoleon is also very similar in its use of practical effects. Godzilla is actually, even though there are heavy VFX in Godzilla, the VFX supervisor is also the director of Godzilla. So there was this idea or concept of filmmakers being creative and the VFX dealing with the results. And this is definitely a case where if you listen to interviews with the VFX artists or the VFX supervisors behind, in between the lines, there's questions like, oh, well, Gareth Edwards, the director, is super experienced in visual effects. Therefore, he must have made it easier. And the answer is almost always, well, yes and no. He knows a lot. Therefore, he's going to try and do a lot of things, which makes our lives harder. At the same time, he knows a lot that helps us in sort of how we shoot things and put things together. So I think that combination of know-how, scrappiness, $80 million budget as opposed to a $200 million budget, it looks like a $200 million movie. There's no question when you watch that film. It's an original sci-fi film that does a ton of world building, but almost all the shots on the Earth are practical plate shots. The only place where it gets super CG is when they go up into the Nomad space station. All of those backgrounds are CG. And in that case, they designed and built that CG environment and used their LED screen to sort of light the actors and to add the realism to those shots. So again, a great use of technology, but still trying to ground it in some practical way. And the LED screens have now become the vehicle for that. And that, I bet that Greg Fraser had a lot to do with that, since he had experience with the LED screens on Batman. So last year on Batman. So I think there's a lot of great and impressive sort of VFX work in this film, and that's it's the quality across the bar in this film is very high in terms of its realism and what it did with the robots.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it is almost like two different processes, right, Kent, where the Earthbound stuff is kind of using the sort of like shoot first and kind of fill in the plates as is. And then the back end, sort of climactic stuff in the space station is probably a little bit more traditional.
Right. They had to design the space station before they shot it with the LED screens, or else they wouldn't know what they were going to shoot. I mean, it was incredible. If you look at any of the behind the scenes stuff, like even like the factory is a practical factory that they shot inside of. And then they just augmented that with additional CG elements. Sometimes, like you said, pasted in 2D elements just to make the background look a little more high tech. So they were very smart in how they approached all of that world building, considering their budget and sort of where they were sort of with like trying to stay within that budget. And I think that was super smart. the design by James Cline cannot be discounted either, because I think that played into how they could shoot the movie the way they wanted to. Like, he made everything grounded in his designs of like the world, and so there was always some part of it that could be shot practical. You know, even the LA stuff, maybe the foreground freeway was practical, and then beyond it was a giant crater from the nuclear bomb explosion.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. It's interesting too, like kind of watching one of the interviews with Gareth Edwards about him trying to convince ILM on a way of working that might be cheaper. Because usually their usual process is they'll model an entire environment out to the bolt, like just super, super detailed. And they do that because normally you have a thing and then you go to shoot and then the director changes his mind, like, oh, let's shoot this way. And then ILM's like, no problem. We have the whole thing. Yeah. We have it all completely modeled. So what Gareth wanted to do is shoot those plates first. So he did that. And then he said, all you have to do is fill in these 3 shots with this thing. And then so all you have to do is simple geometry and just sort of project like some texture or painting on top of that. And it was very much against their philosophy. And they're kind of like, I don't know. But it, you know, and at the end of the day, it's faster to do that. And so you're not kind of developing a certain asset or environment for like months or weeks. You only see it for a short amount of time. And then, but here they only build what they need and then they can move on.
And I think this shows sort of the adaptability of VFX in the modern era. Like, they were willing to go outside their comfort zone and say, hey, we're going to get in this together. We realize the budget's 80 million, but we can still do this thing. And I think that I applaud that, because so many times in my past life, it's been very sort of rigid. And I think that rigidity is what filmmakers hate about VFX, is that it turns into this giant game of limitations. And then they don't like the final product that they get at the end or the final result. And I think this let the filmmakers be who they are is sort of the theme of this year, really, if I had to think about it in terms of the VFX nominees.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to take us to our next nominee, Godzilla -1, and the nominated team is Takashi Yamazaki, Kyoko Shibuya.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Masaki Takahashi, and Tetsuji Nojima.
Great. I think you did great on that.
Thanks, kid. Talk to us about Godzilla -1.
So I loved this film. Godzilla -1 is actually a great movie. And it's something that I recommend to actually everyone I talk to about movies this year. I think it's been an extraordinary year for movies in general. But this is by far the best Godzilla movie in a long time. And I'm a huge Godzilla fan, so I have a bias. But this film is made by a Japanese filmmaker in Japan for Toho. It is the origin of Godzilla. It goes back to his roots as far as what he represents in Japanese culture. It talks about post-World War II Japan, and it has a lot to say about it. It has a lot to say about what the people think of the government and how the war effort went. And sort of, I think that it's a very nuanced film in a lot of ways. And it's also it has lots of nods to the original Godzilla, the 1954 original black and white Godzilla film, and the metaphor of Godzilla as the atomic bomb, and all of those all of the subtext of Godzilla is in this film. And it's in Japanese, and that's the extraordinary thing. It's a box office hit, considering it's a foreign film, it's a Godzilla movie, and its budget is only $15 million. I just want to say that again. We were just talking about The Creator being $80 million as a low-budget VFX-driven film. This is a $15 million film. And it is the greatest example in this list of doing more with less. The total VFX team size, 35 people. The director was also the visual effects supervisor for the movie. And this eliminated a ton of back and forth between artists, managers, production support, and the director. It basically closed the gap. And this film, more than any other at the VFX Oscar Bake-Off, it really established itself as a frontrunner from their presentation. They had this charming, unbelievable presentation where they had set up like 7 action figures of Godzilla, and they labeled one with a paper that says director, and they labeled another one with artist, and then they physically removed all of the in-between Godzillas and put the two together and basically said, this is how we did the movie. And and I think the camaraderie of the team is super evident when they talk about the film. There was 610 visual effects shots in the movie. There's 100 water effect shots. For the budget, it is incredibly ambitious. They made sure that Godzilla looks like a man in a suit in that how the creature moved. And it was all done partially in homage to the original, but also budgetary constraints. There were questions from the Academy at the bake-off about, well, what did you do about your muscle simulation and how did you do it on this budget? And the director slyly said, well, we didn't have any muscle simulation because the original suit didn't have muscle simulation, and that limitation became a bonus for us. And it was sort of, I'm paraphrasing here. And the fact that it did kind of look like a man in a suit, but still looked real and was shot in a manner that didn't stand out as fake was extraordinary and worked out in their favor. They didn't try to do more than they could have. And as far as the water shots go, the lead compositor for the film, Tatsuji Nojima, was actually doing Houdini, which is another 3D package, effects work at home with water, brought it into the office and said, well, this is what I've been doing at home. And the director said, that looks great. Let's put some more water shots in the movie. And they ended up increasing the number of shots of water simulation because the lead compositor had just happened to be doing it. They went with a different strategy than most visual effects have driven films. They allowed each artist to do an entire effect themselves, the modeling, the effects work, the compositing. In today's age, most larger visual effects driven films are specialized in like allowing, there's the modeler, there's the effects artist, there's the animator, there's the rigger, and there's the compositor, and there's the lighter. Like they're all separate. And in this case, because they were smaller, they had to be scrappy, and they did all of this work with these 35 people.
I love this one too. It felt more like sort of post-war family melodrama that was interrupted by a monster movie, you know. So both the human story and the Godzilla story, they're intertwined and they're both great, and you care about the characters. And so I think, you know, again, visual effects all in service of that. And I think having the director, the same person as the visual effects supervisor, in this case is a great service because he knew exactly what he needed. He knew exactly the story he was trying to tell, and it all kind of fed into that. And Kent, you're right. I mean, it does harken back to the old golden age of Godzilla in that the movie does a great job of sort of riding that line between sort of the old school miniature guy in suit effects, right, and the modern sort of photoreal, you know, disaster film effects, right? So it totally rides that line where sometimes you look at a shot and it's like, oh no, that's a real battleship out there, a real Japanese destroyer. But then when Godzilla shows up, it kind of feels like he's tossing boats around in a bathtub.
Yeah, a little bit, right?
But not quite. You know, it's like riding that line, and it's like, it's just done really well. And even his design, you could tell they looked at the old Godzilla and the way his arms are. It's a guy in a suit. It just the proportions of it. It's not like a real monster with the tiny little T-Rex arms, right? It's like he's got real shoulders, you know, and it both like thematically, it makes him look stronger because he's kind of big, bulky monster, but then also, you know, it just sort of gives you that little tinge back. And then sometimes when the buildings fall apart, it kind of feels like a miniature, but it's so much more complicated.
Yeah,
and so much more
detail in the building collapse that it has all the simulation that makes it look real. And so there's this weird thing that happens in your brain where you know it's, you know, inherently it has to be fake, but there's a part of you that believes it. And in the context of the story, it really works. It just is something that, like, the music comes on, the old Godzilla, they use the old score.
That's right.
And as soon as the score came on, I got chills, you know, and maybe it's just my childhood of knowing those films so well, but as soon as the original score kicks in, it really has an effect of bringing you back to that time and those movies and what they meant. I think the way that they portrayed the atomic breath, it is an atomic bomb blast. Like that is, it literally becomes a thing. So it's an event. When he unleashes the atomic breath, the fins actually protrude, they sort of click out, and then there's a big buildup. And they set this up for the end of the film where there's some time before he's going to be able to do it. And it creates this dramatic tension in all the shots that this thing is going to happen, and I think that it was super effective. There's this funny moment when the VFX team was talking about the limitations, and would say things like, well, we had intended to have a huge hydraulic gimbal for these ship shots, but we only could afford this little piece, and it's literally the railing and a deck. and so they showed the shots, they have the before and after of they're on this ship that's being buffeted by waves, and the actors are hanging onto the railing and moving back and forth, and then they show the actual behind the scenes footage, and the ship is static, the railing is static, and they're literally Star Trekking against it with the camera counter moving to it, and it's that kind of ingenuity. Or there's a jet fighter at the climax of the movie, and they said we were going to get a gimbal and have the cockpit inside this gimbal, so we couldn't afford that, so we got the 4 strongest people on the crew to basically move it, and they show them like with sticks moving the whole like, apparatus. And it's like that kind of ingenuity and scrappiness, I think, is the heart of visual effects, really, of like what it means to like make movies and to like solve problems. And I think it has a real shot. I think that like there's a charm to this movie. There's a charm to the team that presented this film, and it is also garnered extremely great reviews, and it's a box office hit. So I think once all of those things align, people are talking about this film in a way that no other Godzilla film gets talked about.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it was just with a small amount of money, what they were able to do, and most of it is just, they able to incorporate it all in service of the story, because you care about those characters so much. It just, even, I don't know, it reminded me, I remember going to Japan, and when I was there, I watched one authentic Japanese movie, which is a post-war melodrama called Tokyo Story, and it's about this family right after the war and the devastation of Tokyo, and what they had to kind of do and deal with. And it's very much of that same vein, and you care just as much about those people. And that was an old 50s melodrama, and with no effects. And then this is the same thing, and it's a Godzilla movie, and you have the same amount of like emotional weight, and just kudos.
It's the authenticity. Like every filmmaker, whether you're a visual effects artist or you're a director, or an actor, is trying to mine authenticity. And in this film, it oozes authenticity in a way that other Godzilla films have not.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Now, and in some categories, the craft seems to stand separate from the movie itself. In other words, I think of hair makeup, where they'll pull out a movie that's the only place it's been nominated, but they're talking about some of the prosthetic work or some specific slice. Here, you guys seem to be suggesting that how the movie turns out overall, and how visual effects is trying to integrate with this overall story, maybe carries more weight than it might in some other categories. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, people are going to vote the way they want to vote for whatever reasons they have, but maybe that's actually a feature here and how it integrates with these other story ideas.
I think, it's a monster movie, but like you genuinely care for the characters. So it makes, when Godzilla attacks, it even though looks kind of like a guy in a suit, even though that's there, you care about the characters. And what Kent's saying with the gimbal on the ship and they're getting tossed around, you care about them and you don't want them to get injured. And so it just makes it all that much more exciting and integrated.
I think visual effects can often be the most unpredictable category in the Oscars, partly because it is a case where the expertise is difficult to sometimes ascertain what's real and what's fake and what's done as a visual effect. And the movie does carry it at times. And that's why you have upsets. There are years where there's like, if you compare like the Visual Effects Society Award winner versus the Oscar winner, it's different. And I think it's because of that. I think that there are times where the quality of the film carries it. And I think I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Because part of it is the visual effects are so integrated into the film that it creates a complete experience.
Yeah, and I think so, and that's why this year is pretty interesting, because we have all the nominees are pretty good contenders for the award.
Yeah,
We're
I
like
think lately. Yeah,
last year we had Avatar,
yeah,
and so you're just sort of like, well, that's great, but and then you have all the other nominees, and you're like, well, those are great movies too, but there's just no chance, you know. So this one is really interesting because they all have slightly different philosophies, slightly, and hugely different budgets.
right.
Um, but they're all kind of doing things to, hopefully integrate into the story. It's that whole thing when, if you see I mean, it's any discipline, but with visual effects, if you see a visual effect, it's a visual effect, then it kind of takes you out of it, and the jeopardy is gone, or the tension is gone, and it ruins the experience.
All right, well, let's compare that to the next film on our list, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And the nominated team is Stefan Soretti, Alexis Weisbrot, Guy Williams, and Theo Balick.
Teo.
I think it is Teo.
Teo.
Yeah.
And you think it's Balick, or is that wrong as well?
Bialik, maybe?
Sorry, Teo, that's on me. Guys, what do you have to say about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3?
So with Guardians, I really like this movie. I think it's a good closure to the trilogy. And it's an interesting movie in that it's primarily Rocket's story, who is a raccoon. And so you need to have emotional weight. And so I think the visual effects were a great use of that in service of this emotional weight and emotional story of Rocket's sort of, from basically small childhood birth to who he is currently and how he became to be. And so I know at the beginning of the production, what they ended up doing to tell his story and the story of his friends, and so how he kind of came out, they just went to a simple motion capture stage, which is the stage where it's basically blank, and all the actors are there with their suits and dots. And so they acted out all the scenes just as humans, as actors, to get that performance there and all that emotional weight with real actors. And then they went back and sort of overdid it with each of the sort of creature or animals. And so I think this one is a great example of like how that kind of pushes through, and there's a lot of other interesting things in this movie as well, as far as this sort of the different environments, and some are sort of more biomechanical, so that there's a certain level of complexity there. There's also a huge oneer, which is a giant continuous shot in the fighting that's really interesting, that had to be timed to music, which is also a bigger complexity. And so I think all the little this one ticks a lot of boxes for me. And it's also obviously very compelling visually. Each little environment has its own characteristic and color palette, and it's very striking.
So, Chris, so you're saying this visual effects work is supported by some of Bradley Cooper's best work this year? You're thinking this is the one he should have been nominated for rather than Maestro, then, just because of what he brought to it, what they could build around.
I mean, less prosthetics, I'm sure, but I think he just sort of brings it. You can hear it in his voice, and the odd thing is, a lot of the motion capture was not Bradley Cooper. It's I forget the other actor's name.
It's James Gunn's brother, right? Isn't it James?
Yeah,
Gunn's brother?
It's James Gunn's brother does a lot of the motion capture. So Bradley Cooper comes in and does a lot of the, obviously does all the voice acting, which is extremely hard to do, to get directed, and you're just sitting in a chair and a microphone. But he, you can hear it in his voice, all the pain and anger and, all that sort of emotional journey that the film takes. But the motion capture performances are done by other artists or other motion artists. So I find that interesting too.
Yeah, that's the melding. And then not only that, then there's the animation side of it. So what Chris is talking about in terms of that scene of their origin of them, they shot 366 shots in the first 2 days. That's 12% of all the VFX shots. And then they had all this time to create the rigs and to like create the characters, and even Rocket, who they've already created once, several times. They had to go back to the drawing board in order to get the emotion. The characters are so important in that they're the close-ups. And what people should pay attention to the eyes. When you look at the like Rocket Raccoon's eyes in this movie, that they for sure redesigned the rig and how those moved, how the eyes moved in order to get the level of emotion, but yet still retain the animalistic quality of a raccoon at the same time. You're riding that line between anthropomorphic and animal, and they did a great job of sort of setting that up. And it's one of the things that the rigging and the character rigging on a sequel is something that's always discussed. Like, is like the pros and cons of re-rigging a character, because that's time that it takes to, when I say rigging, it's creating the infrastructure to animate the character itself. And new technologies come up, new needs on the show come up, but at the same time, the old rig has all the old like knowledge and know-how that went into building that and animating that character that now you're going to throw away and redo. And so that conundrum comes up often in sequels, and they made the right decision to like basically go in and redo all of that rigging on Rocket for sure. And Groot obviously would have to be redone because he's a different age than he was the previous film. And so this movie represents the Marvel edition. Every year since I've been involved with visual effects and Marvel's been around, they've had at least one film nominated for best visual effects. This is their entry for this year. They have yet to win it though. Marvel has never won best visual effects. And even though it's been nominated probably more times as a studio than a lot of other ones, but they've never won. And this is sort of their swan song for Guardians of the Galaxy. It'll be interesting to see if that can garner, the award. And it's in the running for sure. As there's 3,066 shots in the film. It's probably one of the higher budget shows. It features as Chris said, every aspect, environments, character work. There's a scene with like 600 furry creatures escaping the ship. Like those are all like 600 creatures that have to be animated, built, rigged, and animated and surfaced and lit. There's the big oneer, the 2-minute shot of them fighting in the hallway, which basically comprised of 17 different takes that are stitched together with real actors and with digital doubles. Like there's a high degree of difficulty in all of that work. And so that's why it's nominated. It has all those characteristics in this one film, So in some ways, it's great that it comes right after Godzilla -1, because here you have like and it's sandwiched between you have Godzilla, you have Guardians, and then you have Mission Impossible, like in a row. Those are 3 very different kinds of movies and 3 very different kinds of visual effects, which makes it hard to compare. It makes it really like it's not a fair comparison between all these movies, and that's why it can go any way, really.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that like this is the Marvel entry into this whole thing, in that because normally we kind of look at Marvel and it's more of quantity rather than quality. They have some amazing stuff, but this one I think throughout just has both quantity and quality through the entire movie.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's the most like Guardians of the Galaxy to some degree is the most unlikely hit of the Marvel franchise, right? Of the Marvel universe, right? If you were to just describe the elements of Guardians of the Galaxy before they made the first one, I think you wouldn't make a lot of people wouldn't bet on that. And they came out, it was James Gunn's vision of that sort of that group is what made it a hit and made it what it was. And this is the culmination of all of it, for the franchise. So I think they did a great job with this film.
Yeah. And I think specifically this one has a real good shot because of, it has to carry all that emotion with it and believability in those, all the creatures' performances. And like you said, they have to hold up. There's some really extreme close-ups of these CG characters, eyes crying and all that. And you believe it, and it works within the film. You just totally get it.
I think it's interesting that it was criticized for displaying animal cruelty. Like that was an actual, at the time of release, this movie was criticized for how it glorified or depicted animal cruelty. And I'm like, these are all visual effects animals. None of them are real. And I understand that the criticism is about the idea of it, but it's so effective. That says a lot about the visual effect, that people would be willing to come out, because if it's cartoon violence, nobody cares. But if it feels real, then people start to really care about those things. And it shows you how effective that visual effect was. And I think it's a testament to these artists that it was a criticism.
Yeah, yeah, indeed.
Well, the fourth film on our list, as we previewed, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. And the nominated team is Alex Woodka, Simone Coco, Jeff Sutherland, and up again, Neil Corbould. Did I say it right this time, Chris? Got it?
You got it dead on.
You nailed it.
Dead on. Okay.
Yeah. Dead Reckoning.
So I do believe that as of right now, the part 1 has been removed. I think that is as a little revisionist history on the Mission Impossible franchise, that they've decided on streaming that it no longer has the part 1 for some reason. So this is, again, Mission Impossible. It fills the void left by James Bond last year, being a stunt-heavy action adventure that is photoreal, in which the visual effects are often downplayed and not discussed. But, partly because Tom Cruise famously does his own stunts, and he famously does the motorcycle jump with the parachute. It's just an amazing stunt, and I still can't believe he does that stuff. And no diss on Tom Cruise. And I'm actually in awe of the fact he's doing that stuff. But this takes that role in this lineup of films, and is in this sort of category of film, is actually extraordinary. Like the works that often invisible, you don't realize it's there. For example, there is a scene in this film in which the character of Benji, played by Simon Pegg, diffuses a bomb inside an airport, and specifically in a baggage sorting area. And yes, they went to an actual airport and shot a baggage sorting area and scanned it to build the models, but they shot the actual photography on a green screen with foreground props, like with a conveyor belt, and everything else was filled in. And you would not know that watching the film. Like they did, it's so photoreal, you don't realize that. Or they go to the American sort of spy center, and it's a room full of people on desk terminals. And they only had people in the foreground, and the hundreds beyond it were all filled in. The walls were all replaced, and you wouldn't know it watching the film. So there's another example of an invisible effect. And then, of course, we get to the stunts, and you get to the big car chase that happens in Spain, I believe it is. And those scenes are filmed. They had to build special practical cars where the driving is actually done in the back seat. So the actors could be in the front seat. When Haley Atwell's driving, I think it's a BMW SUV. And so they could film her driving, but she's not really driving. The person in the back seat that they paint out later is the stunt person is driving them through actual streets of Spain, or the sets they're in. They're putting in CG cars that they're avoiding that look photoreal. And then they get to the famous steps where is it a Fiat? It's a little miniature car.
Yeah, a little Fiat on the Spanish steps in Rome.
Falls down the steps, and they obviously couldn't film that, or they ruined the steps. That's a set, let's say, filmed in which they, replaced most of the background with the Spanish plates, or with a CG recreate of the plates. And the standout for the film, of course, is the climactic train locomotive, falling in, and Tom Cruise and Haley Atwell running up the falling train, where they had to build like 3 different gimbals to do it. They took a practical real locomotive and shot it into a quarry and filmed that and augmented that. Yes, they actually did like this is the kind of budget for these films, right? Like this is again, in comparison to Godzilla, where they couldn't get a single gimbal. They had probably 3 or 4.
Yeah, they used a real train.
They had a real train locomotive front. Like they shot it into a quarry and filmed it hitting the bottom, and then augmented it with CG. So, and they put cameras on it, obviously, to get all the shots. So that gives you a sense of all of the things, even in the gimbal shots inside the interior of the train cars, where it's each successive cars falling one after another, and Tom Cruise and Haley have to climb as it's falling, and they're in a gimbal, meaning that it's actually inverted. that they replace the interior with a CG interior and then put CG debris that's falling past them because they can't endanger the actors, obviously, and they're all rigged up with harnesses so they don't fall to their, or get hurt. And they paint out all of that stuff. But it's an amazing amount of work that has to go into even doing something that's practical. So, and that is not taking away from the acting at all. It's not taking away from this. And I think that's what's unfair about some of the when people say, oh, it was all practical. Yes, the actors acted and it was all, and they had to defy gravity to some degree, and they were hard stunts. But all of them after were CG augmentation. And that doesn't detract from the actors. It doesn't detract from the stunts or the photography. It only enhances the viewing experience. And a friend of mine who I saw at the VFX Bake Off remarked to me, visual effects is the only aspect of filmmaking that the filmmakers deny. You never hear someone say, oh, well, we didn't have any makeup on our movie, or we didn't have any costumes in our movie, but they'll say we didn't have any visual effects. And it really is a shame, because in a film like this, it's extraordinary. There's great stunts and there's great visual effects.
Yeah, I think the whole train sequence is a great example because, it's really Tom Cruise on top of that train. Like, he's really on there. But if you look at the plates of the train, one car is missing because that's where all the camera equipment and stunt people are. So they had to put that car back in. And, it's like, it's really Tom Cruise on those gimbals, like when that train is falling down, like he's really climbing up.
Yes.
But like the piano's fake, they're not going to throw a grand piano at Tom Cruise.
No matter how good he's at stunts, they're not going to throw a grand piano at Tom Cruise.
No, but he's
how much he asked for it. He's throwing the piano. Right? No, someone else is going to overrule.
I think there's going to be some insurance guy on the set going, I don't think so.
The Steinway is going to take us over budget. They can't do that.
And then of course the great stunt of him on the motorcycle and parachuting off the cliff, like he actually did that. All they had to do is augment the cliff face so that instead of a stunt ramp, it's like a grassy,
dirt and grass, right?
So like that's kind of a minimal effort. I had a couple of quotes from Christopher McQuarrie, from the director, right, where one of his criticisms, now he loves visual effects, like he's into visual effects, but one of his criticisms for visual effects was, you get what you want. And so that is a limitation to him. And so I think that's why they like doing as much as possible practically, because you get all those chaotic unknowns. Right. He was saying, like, one of the things that he was happy about, they really launched a locomotive off a cliff. Now they had to augment that heavily, but they actually put cameras on the side of a locomotive as it went off. And they were saying that the wheels going around created some sort of torque force that was very weird for the camera. And it looked very fast and dangerous. And he was happy, that he got that. So even though they have to augment that, but the base plate's there. Also, the same thing with the stunt of, Tom Cruise and Haley Atwell are trying to climb up the car, and it's a kitchen car and there's grease coming down. Yeah. And so there's actual grease on there, and they're actually climbing up this gimbaled train car. And so there's a lot of chaos in them actually trying to climb up and slipping and coming around. And so that's stuff you just can't plan for. And then you can augment it. And so, and I think that kind of thing, in going back to the creator, that sort of Gareth Edwards mentality of try to shoot as much practically, because you get that sort of chaotic happenstance that you didn't really plan for, and then use it, and then you can kind of alter it from there. Yeah. And it's pretty incredible.
And that's a nod to Neil Corbell. So his name come up every year. We have Neil Corbell, and there's a reason why. At least once. So because he's the special effects supervisor coordinator, it's his job to like build the gimbal, like to oversee the building of the gimbal, and the magic of all of these real things, are under his, domain, and he should be in the list. Like that is a nod to his craftsmanship and his ability to plan and to build and construct, and his crew of people that have to build these things to like make these things happen and be safe. Like let's throw that in there. They have to be safe. They have to do these crazy mechanical things, but still be safe, and he's able to do that. And that's why he's constantly on our list. Like, I think every year I've done this with you, Skid, his name's on the list for some movie or another movie. And like it deservedly so.
Yeah. No, he's been around for a while, and he's always doing very interesting things. And he's going to be, I think he's in our next movie too, right?
In fact, that'll take us right into it. Our fifth film on the list is Napoleon. Nominated team is Charlie Henley, Luke Ewan, Martin Fennelly. Oh, I made a mess of that one for sure. Simone Coco is back, and rounding it out, Neil Corbold. That is Simone's second and Neil's third nomination this year, and I do wonder which teams they're going to sit with. Conversation for another podcast. For this, let's talk about Napoleon.
Yeah, with Neil Corbold, though, you just wonder who's going to sit with him. So, yeah, so this is an incredible film as well. I mean, it's a very long film, and it's a very beautiful film. I mean, it's Ridley Scott, famous, very famous director, of course. And so he's famous for drawing his own storyboards. So he has a design background from way back when. And so he's very meticulous. So he draws his own storyboards, and is always kind of seeking out to get a specific vision. And a lot of Napoleon was based on, some of the imagery was based on these old, like 19th century paintings. So it has that feel to it in that sort of historical context. And then just bring up Neil Corbold again. This is an amazing film because, again, you have to work, just like Mission Impossible, you have to work hand in hand, both the special effects, the physical effects, and the visual effects, the CG stuff. And so they had to kind of work in unison. One of the examples with Napoleon they're talking about is like the cannon fire. So Ridley really wanted to see smoke come out of those cannons on set. And so Neil Corbold came up with a whole system, I think using like baby powder.
It's talcum powder.
Talcum powder.
But I mean, it's the same kind of thing.
It's the same thing, right? So so they would at least have an effect, something coming out of the muzzle of the cannon that they could shoot. And then, of course, the visual effects companies, whether it was ILM or whoever, had to come back and sort of augment that to make it, powerful and actually see the cannonball and all that stuff. And so this, again, is a beautiful film. In the VES world, this is nominated for supporting visual effects, which is a little bit arguable because I
think it's a little arguable on this one.
There's over 1,000. There's over 1,000 shots in this one, but it's again, it just kind of it's all there to support the story, which I think it does beautifully well. Like, you believe you're in early 19th century France, right? One of the other sort of anecdotes they were talking about is, augmenting the environments. So they would shoot in these beautiful old homes, in rooms, that were all 18th and 19th century built. And so they were not allowed to use candles, real open flames, because they had all these old paintings and such. So Neil Corbold came up with another ingenious thing, was using tiny little LEDs on top of each candle. And it was so convincing with both the color temperature and everything on film that when it was sort of in the background and kind of out of focus, they just left it. But then the CG artist had to come in and sort of augment the flame and make it real flames. So they photographed real flames to put in all that. So then you get that feeling of almost like in Barry Lyndon from Stanley Kubrick, which is famous for using available light. You get that same kind of sense that, it's not very fake. It feels like real candlelit rooms. And so I found like that was pretty impressive too. And there's so much more.
I mean, they had 100 real life horses on set, 300 men at times. So 11 cameras shooting simultaneous, 14 practical cannons firing talcum powder. They figured out, like Neil Corbold figured out how to explode the ground underneath actors without hurting them. So those shots in the big battle in which a cannonball hits a guy, and the ground underneath him explodes and he dies. That actually was shot. A lot of that was shot practically, and they had come up with a system that would be, not obviously not hurt the actor. So like that's a pretty big innovation in my mind in terms of it's risky, and two, that you figured out how to do it without hurting somebody is an incredible feat unto itself. So hats off to Neil Goldblum. I think it's Blenheim Palace in Woodstock, England. They use that to substitute for the Kremlin and Tuileries Palace in France, where because we really wanted to shoot practical. Again, let the filmmakers be who they are. Shoot practical and replace after. And those are fairly, if you know anything about architecture, those are very different architecture to use for the same set, the same location, yet they did that. I think one of the standout effects, which is not talked about that often, which I think should be talked about, is the burning of Moscow. Those shots, when that happens, it looks amazing. And it reminds me a little bit of 1917, the night shots when the main character is in the city that's on fire and getting blasted. They're beautiful, and Roger Deakins had shot that, and it's like stunning. In the same way, it reminded me back of those scenes in 1917. I thought that was an effective visual effect. The battle of all the battles, and there were many battles, the Battle of Austerlitz is amazing. It's the one where Napoleon has tricked the enemies onto the ice and then blows up the ice and they fall through. It is stunning. All of the underwater shots are great. It's a great blend of practical and visual effects and plate photography. It's super well done. I also think one of the interesting things, this is the first movie I've watched from this time period where the strategy of how to fight is very clear. Like you really see, like Waterloo is a great example where the British soldiers come down and they form a square, and then the French soldiers are circling them on their horses, and they're shooting. The square is shooting outward at the French soldiers. I had never seen that before. I guess I'm not a big history buff enough to know the strategy there, but it was interesting that the visual effects allowed that to be very clear. And I thought that was an interesting part of how the visual effects supported the film in terms of showing battles in the way that they were fought. There's been a lot of talk on the internet when it came out about how inaccurate the movie was in a historical inaccuracies, but I think the battles were pretty accurate in terms of the strategy. They worked very hard, it appeared to me, to get the strategy of the battles to work. And I thought that was a very interesting aspect of watching the film. And you don't think about the visual effect. You're just watching the battle happen, and you're sort of thinking about what's happening, not how they achieve the effect. It's in this year's categories, it's very similar to All Quiet on the Western Front. So All Quiet on the Western Front, World War, a different war, obviously, than the stuff that's happening here. But I think in the same way that it occupies that space, and we've talked about how these other films occupy different spaces in this year's Oscars, and I think this one occupies the space of All Quiet on the Western Front, and that the thing that is highlighted, it really is the battles more than anything else. And in sort of reading about how Ridley Scott referenced 18th century paintings, especially the shot of the Sphinx, in which Napoleon sees the Sphinx and he's writing a letter, and there's like a voiceover of him talking, in his letters back to his wife. It's actually an exact sort of composition from an 18th century painting. It reminded me of how when DreamWorks was trying to make Gladiator, they wanted to woo Ridley Scott to direct it. They pulled out an 18th century painting of the Roman Colosseum, of the decision of whether or not to kill or spare one of the gladiators, and that hooked Ridley Scott. So it was Walter Parks, and then the producer Douglas Wick showed him this painting, said, "You should direct this movie," and it captured his imagination. And it's interesting that he would use the same technique to sort of show his team what he wanted the battles to look like.
Yeah, it's a great, because even with a sort of emperor coronation, which is a very famous painting of him, they sort of captured that well. I mean, going back to the battles too, Ken, I think one of the first ones, that sort of the siege of Toulon.
Yes.
That one is a very interesting one in that, because it kind of shows Napoleon becoming Napoleon. So he was just sort of a sort of top lieutenant, and then this is the one he kind of showed his ingenuity on how the British were occupying this seaside port. So they captured it took those guns and turned it onto the, very famously strong British Navy and kind of got rid of the British.
Yes. Yeah.
And you can kind of see, like, they had to do tons of augmentation. Obviously, they built or found a little bit of set, but that whole town, along with the boats, they had one boat.
Yeah.
And so they had to create like 100 boats. And so it's great because you can shoot out there and you have one boat, so you have something to go against. And now you can create all these, like the HMS Victory, these giant old 19th century British battleships, and you kind of experience it through Napoleon. And famously, he gets shot off the horse. And again, with Neil Cornwell, they had to kind of figure out how to do that without killing anyone. And so that was
horses.
Or any horses. That's
or
right.
any horses. So yeah, they came up with a great rig to kind of throw the stuntman, make it believable, but then go back in and augment it again to make it kind of gruesome, and Napoleon becoming unfazed with that. But yeah, you kind of experience it through Napoleon, and all these visual effects shots are just in support of that, so that you could see how he actually becomes the sort of powerhouse that he became.
It's great. It's great. That effect of the horse getting hit by a cannon is photoreal and totally believable and really well done.
Yeah.
Well, as you guys have said, all of these movies, it's tough to see who's going to come out on top with the voting. That being said, as I always ask, are there any other 2023 films you want to call out for achievement in visual effects?
I don't think you can talk about any film from last year and about visual effects and not mention Oppenheimer. Like, that's probably the elephant in the room, to be frank, is that it didn't make the short list to get nominated. And it's kind of shocking that it did not. Like, I think that's worth a discussion. And it could be the backlash to Christopher Nolan talking about how there were no visual effects in the film. It could be backlash to the fact that he denied people credits at the end of the film, or I don't know if it was him, so I can't say it was him, but there were so many visual effects artists who didn't get a credit at the end of that film. And it fit the narrative of not having visual effects. And again, that theme was last year also with Top Gun. And I don't know exactly where that comes from. I'm sure it's like there's many rants on the internet about how bad CG is. But I think Oppenheimer deserved to at least be considered. It's a phenomenal film, and the visual effects, again, support the film. And they show the atomic bomb blast in a way that's not traditional. And the use of practical special effects for the atom, and the way that Nolan's used special effects and visual effects is actually really great. And I would love to see those artists rewarded, if not with credits, but at least some mention and some recognition. If you look at the other major awards, it got nominations, in the other awards around the world for visual effects. And I think it's, at least should be part of the discussion.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it did get nominated for a Visual Effects Society award,
right?
For supporting. And you're right. I mean, it's kind of similar than All Quiet on the Western Front because they use primarily photographed effects, that were somewhat augmented in the compositing. And so your digital compositor is the real hero here, but they're trying to visualize things not how we would normally visualize them, but how they thought Oppenheimer would see it in his head. So if you're talking about, the electrons in an atom or the explosions or the atomic reactions, it was all done very expressively.
Yeah.
With
it's
all
a
these
moment. It's a moment,
yeah,
right?
It's a moment.
It's a very untraditional. And I love the film, and I think Christopher Nolan's a great filmmaker. All I want is just like the artists who work so hard on all these movies to be recognized for their effort. That's all. Like, it's one of those things. It's a real shame that that's where we are in the sort of the filmmaking world now, where like CG is a bad word. And if someone does visual effects, if someone doesn't do any visual effects, it's a badge of honor in some way. Whereas it's just another tool that artists work very, very hard to like make them seamless. When they are seamless, they should be rewarded for that. I think, it's like one of those things that's just a shame.
It is true. And I think, So it's sort of like visual effects along with stunt people are Hollywood's dirty little secret. And sometimes I think it's easier if you're doing if it's a big movie and you want to be taken seriously and it's a serious drama, don't have stunts and don't have visual effects, because
Yeah, maybe that's what it is.
and I think that might have part way to do with it, is if you want to be taken serious as a filmmaker, you're not doing, guys in rubber suits and CG things, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So maybe it's partly that, and it probably a little overdone and misguided.
I feel badly for the artists and all the people that
Yeah.
like the visual effects supervisors, the special effects people. They deserve to be recognized. They did a great job. And no knock on the movie, no knock on. I think I understand Christopher Nolan is a fantastic filmmaker. He has to be to balance all of these things to create the movie he did. I just wish that the movie just could be perceived as an overall cinematic journey that used every tool, because I think it did. Like, that's the truth. Like, that movie used every tool. Barbie used every tool. Like, it's funny,
Yeah.
because Barbenheimer, in my opinion, those two movies were the best of Hollywood. It really, in a lot of ways, like they bucked a lot of trends, they innovated, but they also used practical things. And there's a lot of great acting in both those films, and there's a lot of great filmmaking, production design. And I think the visual effects helped those two movies be great. And I just wish that they were a little bit more recognized than they got, that's all.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention Barbie as well too, because it didn't get nominated, but it's interesting because when you're in Barbie's world, things look fake, but that was kind of the point.
That's kind of the point, right? Is that
right?
It's just,
so
made up plays, right?
I kind of, it was very fun, and there wasn't really much that took you out of it, and even when they're like crossing from the Barbie world to the quote real world, there were a lot of expressive things in there, but it just kind of all worked within the philosophy of itself.
It's great. It's really well done, and like the moving backgrounds and like the practical, like the having the track of the tread of ground that comes by the wheels, all of that stuff.
Right.
It's fantastic. It's and I wish they would be rewarded a little bit more. Like, that's kind of like to me it's innovative to buck the trend, to try something different. And not only that, like, you're taking a risk. I applaud the people that take risks and try things, because like it's not easy to be out there. And that's why Greta Gerwig's amazing for making that film to some degree, because it's a risky film and she owned it. And Margot Robbie owned it. And I love that. And I think that's what we need in filmmaking to keep audiences coming back, is risk taking.
And along that same vein, I don't know if I could just mention real quickly, Poor Things, because it does try to kind of introduce these different worlds in a kind of childlike wonder, because it's from the vantage point of someone who has a child brain. Right. And so it's very expressive, not photoreal, but that's okay, because that's kind of the point as well. And
in its own way, it's very similar to Barbie in that way, in the way that you pointed out.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, I don't know, I just kind of like that. I enjoy that. So if you're trying to go for expressiveness, you just sort of lean into that. So the way that Barbie and now Poor Things do that.
I think Poor Things is a fantastic film. It's really enjoyable for me. I really enjoyed watching that film, and I think it has a vision. That's the other thing about both Barbie and Poor Things. The directors of both those films had a vision, and the visual effects supported that vision. And that's what's great about those two films, in my opinion. I think, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Chris. Super cool, expressive, different. It's almost Dali-esque in its portrayal of these other worlds. It's super interesting and just a different take. It's a different take on things that you've seen before, and I applaud it.
Well, I think it's very interesting that both of those films, Barbie and Poor Things and Oppenheimer, are all nominated for production design. In fact, that's the episode we've got coming up next in the queue. To what degree do you think the visual effects has gotten absorbed into the production design credit on those movies?
I don't know. That's a good question.
That is a really good question. There sometimes there is a little bit of a rivalry between the production designer and the visual effects supervisor, and who designs what and at what point things need to be designed. But I would imagine in something like Poor Things, the production designer probably had a heavy hand in all of that.
Yeah, I would think so. I think that both Barbie and Poor Things, the production designer is the most responsible for the vision of the look of those things, for sure.
Yeah.
I think there are times, especially as you get into post, if things get done more in post for some reason, then by that point, the production designer usually isn't on the show anymore. And so it falls to the visual effects department to quote, design things, which I think is hotly debated actually in the film industry. And rightfully so, right? If the production designer is in charge of everything visual in the movie and things are being designed after that person is off, like there is a healthy debate to be had about what is right and what is wrong there, and how to honor the vision of the production designer. Because I think that's what you have to do if you're in that position, is honor the production designer, and because they had a vision, he or she had a vision of what they felt the movie should look like, had the blessing of the director. And so it would be the responsibility of visual effects to carry through on that vision to the best of their ability.
Well, the last question I want to ask you guys, and it does go back to the short list you mentioned. This year, I saw Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse on the list for visual effects. Didn't make the 5, but it's placed on the short list. Is this a sign that we're going to see more animated films recognized in this space, or where is that line just getting blurrier and blurrier?
It appears to be getting blurrier and blurrier. And I was at the Bake Off when they presented. There was a great presentation by Mike Lasker, the VFX supervisor from SPA and Spy, who represented that film. And they made a point of like all the innovation that had to happen to create that movie. And all the tools are the same. The tools of live action visual effects and animated visual effects are the same. Or they do the same things, the same type of things. There is a debate to be had. Now, I'm not going to fall on one side or the other of this. Does photorealism or a plate have anything to do with a visual effect versus an animated visual effect? Is that something we're talking about? But the counter to that is this, that The Lion King, which is almost entirely CG, so it is animated, was not in the category for best animated film, but was in the category for best visual effects. So does that mean there is a line? And I've heard both sides of that debate.
It totally gets blurry, right? Because if you think of Guardians of the Galaxy, where the core story is about a raccoon, and then you have Spider-Man, which is obviously an animated film, like where are we going, Yes. And it's going to get blurrier and blurrier. Now, along with Spider-Man, what they're going to put up is not just the animated characters, right? You're going to throw that out because that's animated, but it's all the visual effects. It's all the visual effects, yes. It's it's like going through the different dimensions,
the world building,
all the world, all that stuff. And what you would classically call a visual effect rather than just the performance of the animated characters. But in the Guardians, though, it is the performance of the animated characters that get called. So it gets a little interesting.
A counter to that would be this, that last year, Marcel the Shell, mostly live action plates, mostly live action, and I say just with the quotes, not to demean it, Marcel being the only animated aspect of that film was nominated for Best Animated Film. Was it not, or was in the running for Best Animated Film? And I loved Marcel the Shell. I found it very charming, And I don't know if there was that much. There probably was debate about whether it should be in that category of Best Animated Film, considering that most of it was not animated, but the main character was. So I think that debate is going to rage on for years to come. And so you see it on both sides now.
Yeah, the line is definitely getting blurrier and blurrier, Skid.
All right, well, we'll put a pin in that. On that note, we'll call it a wrap, guys. Great having you both here.
It was awesome, again, to talk to you, Skid. It was a fun year of movies. I think it's been a great year of movies, so it's been great time.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I love talking about these movies and how they get made. Yeah, it's a great time. Thank you.
I love talking about it as well, obviously. So glad you guys could join. Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. Tell us you love talking about the movies. You'll find my contact info at our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. The Oscar series will continue. This is episode 3 of 12. So if you enjoy what you hear, subscribe. You won't necessarily win your Oscar pool because we're not picking the winners, but you'll definitely sound like the smartest person in the party. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. To all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and spread the word. Thanks again from Below the Line.